The early years of Lieutenant Patrick Kelly, a main character in the Liza Marchant series, written and narrated by Marion Jasper. Margaret and Liam Kelly lived in Belfast and had been married for just over 2 years when their son Patrick was born in 1817. Liam Kelly was a soldier in the British Army and had dodged many a bullet in his army career. Neither Margaret nor Liam had any living relatives, Margaret having been brought up by an elderly aunt who had died before she and Liam married. Liam had been brought up in an orphanage, and it was a natural progression for him to enlist in the army. They had literally bumped into one another when Margaret was working as a cleaner in one of the hostelries that Liam often frequented when he was not on duty. Margaret had been sweeping the floor and had backed into him, knocking his ale out of his hand and soaking the back of her dress. He was about to shout at her to be more careful when she turned, and he was lost for words. Her beautiful large grey eyes stared at him in fear, and he was mesmerised and mumbled at her not to worry. The innkeeper shouted at her and made his way over to her with his hand raised, and she cowered away. Liam stepped between them and told the man not to dare to raise his fist at someone when it was just an accident, and in fact it had really been his fault. Margaret looked up at him, and much as Liam had found her eyes beautiful, she drew in her breath and held the gaze of his fascinating bright blue eyes, which showed such care and concern for her. "What time do you finish work?" asked Liam. She shied away from him, and he gently added, "My name is Liam Kelly. Well, it's really Paul Liam Kelly, but everyone calls me Liam. What is your name?" "Margaret Bernadette O'Connor," she said. "And I have very little time away from here. I live here and work long hours." "Margaret is a lovely name, but I think that I will call you Meg. And I would like to get to know you," said Liam. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. It had been a long time since anyone had said a kind word to her. She was only ever shouted at or propositioned by some of the drunks who frequented the hostelry. "There's no need to cry, pretty lady," said Liam gently. "You're rather wet, Meg. You had better get changed, and when you've changed, perhaps we could go for a walk." "I don't think that it will be allowed," said Margaret. Liam looked down on her and said, "Oh, I think it will be allowed. Go on, go and get changed." He said it with such confidence that she believed him and collected up her broom and made her way to the back of the room and up to where she slept, all under the frowning gaze of the innkeeper, who was about to give vent to his temper. Liam calmly walked over to the man and said, "If you so much as lay one finger on that lady, you will live to regret it, and I'm going to take her out for a walk this afternoon, and I don't want to hear any objections from you. If I find that she suffers at your hands when she returns, or at any time, it will not be just me who comes to find you. I have many army friends who would be only too pleased to practice their boxing skills on you." "You can't threaten me like that," spluttered the innkeeper. "I can, and I have. So bear that in mind when you are tempted to take your temper out on those who cannot defend themselves," said Liam. Margaret appeared in the room. She had changed into what she considered her best clothes, which, although old, were clean, and she looked well dressed. Liam drew in his breath and felt that he had never seen someone so pretty. He put out his arm and led her to the door, which he opened for her. It was a beautiful spring afternoon, and they slowly made their way to the nearby park. They walked and talked and found out all they could about each other until finally Liam had to take her back to the inn, and he had to return to his army barracks. "I cannot see you tomorrow, Meg," he said as he was leaving, "but I will come to see you on the following day, and perhaps we could go out again." I would love to see you again, Liam, but I'm not sure that I'll be able to go out with you, said Meg sadly. Well, we'll see, but I will come and visit you then, said Liam. Back at the army barracks, Liam confided in his friend Ronan that he knew that he had at last found the woman of his dreams, and he was going to marry her as soon as he could. That's very fast work, Liam, said Ronan. Who is she, and what does she say about it? I haven't told her yet, but I know that she will say yes, said Liam. I'd like you to meet her. I'm off duty when you are, so perhaps I could come with you then, but I won't crowd you, said Ronan. Ronan was smiling as he watched Liam getting ready to meet Meg. I've never seen you look so smart, Liam. I hope I don't let you down with my scruffy appearance, said Ronan. Liam laughed. You look fine, Ronan. I can't wait to introduce you to Meg. They reached the hostelry, and the innkeeper seemed very surprised to see them. Meg was nowhere to be seen. Where's Meg? Demanded Liam. Who? Asked the innkeeper, with a slight quiver in his voice. You know who I mean. Margaret. Where is she? Said Liam. She's not well today. My wife is looking after her, said the innkeeper. I don't believe you, shouted Liam. Where's her room? He pushed his way past the innkeeper and into the back of the building, with Ronan following him. He called, Meg! Meg! Where are you? A woman came out of a room and told Liam that he couldn't go in there, which made him realise that it was the room that he needed to go in. He pushed past her, and Ronan followed. Inside the room he could see Meg sitting on a bed and clasping her arms around her chest. She looked up surprised, and Liam could see that she had a bruised chin and a very unflattering black eye. Oh, Meg, did he do that because of me? Said Liam. I'm going to kill him. Leave it to me, said Ronan. You look after your lovely lady. He left the room, and a scuffle could be heard in the bar area. A table could be heard breaking, and a cry of pain from the innkeeper. Come on, Meg, collect up your things, and I'll take you to a place of safety, said Liam. We'll find somewhere for you to stay, and I'll make sure that you don't go hungry. If you like, we can marry as soon as possible. But you don't know me, mumbled Meg. I know you enough to know that I would like to marry you and spend the rest of my life with you, said Liam. That's only because you feel sorry for me, said Meg. I told Ronan before we got here that I was going to marry you, said Liam. I told him that I had found the woman of my dreams. But more important, how do you feel? I would be very grateful if you could help me now, said a very tearful Meg. But I do need to find another job as soon as possible. I have managed to save a few pence over the years, which will see me through for a short while. Are you saying that you don't want to marry me? Said a very concerned Liam. I feel very content and safe in your company, Liam, but I am frightened that if we rush into marriage too quickly, you will feel differently in a short while, said Meg. I know that I will never feel differently about you, Meg, but I understand that you are feeling rushed into something that you may regret, said Liam sadly. I would never, ever regret it, Liam, said Meg quietly. Come on, you two, said Ronan from the doorway. Let's go and find the lovely Meg somewhere to live. Have you got all your things together? I haven't much to get together, said Meg. Ronan handed her some money, and she looked questioningly at him. Well, he owed you some wages, and I wasn't going to let him get away with cheating you. Liam smiled and said, This is my good friend Ronan, by the way. Meg was walked out of the hostelry between two very tall and handsome soldiers, and on the way out one of the customers said that there could be a place at a friend's boarding house, and he told them the address. The place was a good mile away, and Meg was getting some strange looks from passers-by. She did not realise just how damaged her face was looking, and accusing eyes were falling on both Liam and Ronan. Finding the house, Liam bounded up to the front door and knocked gently, and it was eventually answered by a very homely-looking woman. Liam explained that he was looking for accommodation for his fiancée. The woman turned on him and said that she hoped that he was not responsible for her injuries. No, I am not, madam, but I know how it must seem. She was hurt by the man that she worked for, and I cannot allow her to stay there. One of the gentlemen there mentioned that you may have a room that she could have, said Liam, with his most charming smile. She's not saying much, said the woman. She is in shock and quite frightened. It is only by chance that I visited her today, and I found her in this condition, said Liam. The woman looked at them and decided that they could go inside and discuss the matter further. A tear was falling from Meg's eye because Liam was right, that she was shocked and very frightened. The woman put her arm around Meg, and of course that made her cry even harder. I really was looking for somebody who could work around the house and help with looking after the other guests that are here. For that there would be room and board and a small wage. Do you think that you would be capable of that, my dear? Said Mrs. Flynn kindly. Yes, I'm not frightened of hard work, said Meg. Well, we won't get you started for a day or so, said Mrs. Flynn. I can see that you are obviously in some pain. Is it your ribs that were hurt? Meg nodded and burst into tears again. Liam put his arm around her shoulder and said, You're safe now, Meg. You don't have to keep looking over your shoulder any longer, and I'll be back to see you in a couple of days, and we can then talk about getting married. Don't worry, young man. I'll look after her. She looks as if she needs it, said Mrs. Flynn. Shall we have some tea? I'll give you a hand, said Ronan, who was tactfully giving Meg and Liam a short time to themselves. I think this is a good place for you, Meg. Mrs. Flynn seems to be a decent woman, and this looks like a nice, warm and comfortable house. I'm sorry that I won't be able to see you tomorrow, but it will give you a chance to settle in. If you find that you are really unhappy here, then we will think again, said Liam. I can't be more unhappy than I was at the hostelry. This is going to be so good. I didn't know that jobs like this existed, said Meg. I would like us to get married soon, Meg. You know that because I am a soldier I may have to leave at a moment's notice, so I'd like to spend as much time with you as possible. But we can talk about that in a couple of days. I do love you, Meg, and I hope that you feel the same about me, said Liam. I do, Liam. I know we haven't known one another for very long, but I realise that you don't have to when you've found the right person, said Meg. Mrs. Flynn and Ronan returned with the tea, and Ronan commented that he hoped that Meg would not be sporting such a black eye next time he saw her. Liam was telling me how beautiful your eyes were. I'm looking forward to seeing that. Meg looked a little frightened when Liam and Ronan made ready to leave, and Mrs. Flynn stepped in and said that she also was looking forward to seeing them again in a couple of days, and that she was going to take Meg up to her room and get her settled when they had gone. Meg was very happy with Mrs. Flynn. They worked well together and looked after all the other house guests, and 5 weeks after their first meeting, Liam and Meg were married, and Ronan was best man, and Mrs. Flynn was maid of honour. It was agreed that Liam would stay whenever he was off duty. Quite often they also made room for Ronan when he was also off duty. Mrs. Flynn and all her house guests were delightful. 2 years after Liam and Meg were married, Patrick was born, and the first time that he opened his eyes, it could be seen that they were the brightest blue, just like his father's. We must find somewhere to live, said Liam one day to Mrs. Flynn. Why, Liam, said Mrs. Flynn, there's plenty of room for you here. You don't want to be bothered by a young child running around your house, said Liam. I can understand that you probably would like a place of your own, but I shall be so sad to see you go, and young Patrick is no bother. All children cry on occasion. Nobody minds that. And Meg keeps him well fed and clean, so he doesn't cry very often. He probably will when he's teething, but that passes. Please think again, as I'd be lost without Meg, said Mrs. Flynn. Well, if you were sure, but even if we do get another place, you know that Meg would always come and help you, said Liam. I will admit that I feel happy that she is with you, because I never know when I may have to go away. I feel as if you are part of my family, Liam. It was a lucky day when you turned up on my doorstep. 2 years passed, and the Kelly family was soon to become a family of 4. Patrick was growing fast and getting into everything, but he was a firm favourite with all the guests, and especially with Mrs. Flynn. We will now seriously have to think about moving out, Liam said to Mrs. Flynn. You have tolerated Patrick well, but another child will be just too much. I understand that, Liam, but perhaps we could just see how it goes when the new little one gets here. It would be a year or two before you would need more room, said Mrs. Flynn. I know that you really do need a place of your own, but let the new baby arrive and you can think about it then. Liam went to Meg and told her that Mrs. Flynn really didn't want them to leave. He smiled at her and said that as Mrs. Flynn had been so good to them, perhaps waiting until after the new baby arrived would not be such a bad idea. You know that Ronan and I are going to Dublin for a while, said Liam. If it looks like we will be there permanently, then you will be moving there at that time. But it will be decided by the authorities, and the move doesn't have to take place until after the new little one is here. I haven't mentioned to Mrs. Flynn that I could be deployed elsewhere, but it's not definite yet. I feel guilty that it could look as if we are using Mrs. Flynn, and she has been so kind. I think that we should be honest with her and tell her that there is a possibility that we may have to leave for Dublin, said Meg. Mrs. Flynn took their news with sadness, but appreciated their honesty. She agreed that Meg could stay as long as she liked, and hoped that Liam would not be permanently deployed in Dublin. Let's wait and see what happens, she said hopefully. Liam and Ronan left for Dublin with the rest of their troop, and Meg managed to keep occupied with working around the house as well as looking after Patrick. Some people referred to Patrick as Pat or Paddy, but Meg was having none of it. His name is Patrick, not Pat or Paddy or anything else. She was smiled at indulgently and they nodded, and he was always referred to as Patrick from that time onwards. Meg's pregnancy was not going too well. She felt very unwell on many occasions, whereas with Patrick she had blossomed once the morning sickness had passed. 3 weeks after Liam and Ronan had gone to Dublin, there was a knock on the door, and standing on the doorstep was Ronan and a sergeant that Meg had seen before. She had a sinking feeling and knew that something was wrong. "Can we come in, please, Meg?" said Ronan gently. Mrs. Flynn came forward and led them all through to the sitting room, which was when Meg learned that Liam was dead. She collapsed, and Mrs. Flynn and Ronan helped her into a chair. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Kelly," said the sergeant with genuine sympathy. "How did it happen?" demanded Mrs. Flynn. "Several were killed that night. A mob stormed the barracks, and our men were dragged out, and I'm afraid that Private Kelly was stabbed. We are bringing their bodies home for burial. I know that often there is no love lost between the Irish and the English, but they were our men. All of them were Irish," said the sergeant bitterly. Meg had said nothing up until that time. "Can I see him?" she asked. Ronan looked down at his hands and said, "It's best not, Meg." She was left to realise that she must remember him as she had last seen him. She could hear Patrick playing in the hall, and she got up and went to him and slowly took him up to her room and held him tightly for a long time until he got restless and asked if it was tea time. Ronan and the sergeant had left by the time Meg went down to the kitchen with Patrick. Mrs. Flynn had been crying, and yet Meg hadn't shed a tear. "It can't be true, Mrs. Flynn," said Meg quietly. "I'm sure I would have known if he had died." Liam was buried 2 days later, with only Meg, Mrs. Flynn, Ronan and the sergeant in attendance. Slowly they made their way back to the house. Patrick had been with one of the house guests during the service. The next 3 months went from bad to worse for Meg. She had her baby, a little girl, but she was very sickly and needed a great deal of attention. Ronan was shipped abroad to India, and Mrs. Flynn had a stroke and lingered for a few weeks before succumbing and dying. Meg had to pack her bags and find somewhere to live with Patrick and her baby. She managed to find a large ground floor room which did have a fire so that she could at least put some hot food into their stomachs. She found some cleaning work and was able to take Patrick and the baby, Shauna, with her on occasion. Other times she just had to pray that nothing would happen to her children while she worked. Every Wednesday she made her way to the local market and bought the few meagre food items that she could afford. and one of the stalls that she always shopped at was run by Farmer Phelan, who often had his son Michael with him. Colin Phelan was attracted to Meg, but it was too soon for him to make any approaches to her. They both had recently lost their partners, so they had much in common. On occasion, Michael would offer to keep an eye on both Patrick and Shauna, which meant that Meg could take on extra work and provide a few more items for her family. A year passed since Liam had died, and on the anniversary of his death, little Shauna also passed away. Patrick was now 3 years old, and Meg clasped him to her as they said their farewells to Shauna and laid her to rest beside her father. Colin watched all this from afar and wondered how Meg would be able to get over the losses that she had experienced during that year. He saw how she held Patrick tightly and felt that at least she had someone of her own left in this world. He knew how she felt, as he only had Michael in his life now. Most of Patrick's and Meg's meals were vegetables, but every now and again Colin had a chicken that he could let her have, or a cut of meat from one of the animals that he had slaughtered. Sometimes she managed to get some bread or cake from the kitchens of one of the houses where she worked. Life was very hard for them, but they were managing to survive. In the little spare time that she had, she read to Patrick, and as he got older she encouraged him to pick out the words in the few books that she had. Meg was very worried that she would not be able to give Patrick the education that she wanted for him to have. She saw how a lack of education kept men and their families in poverty, and she wanted better for Liam's son. Another year passed, and Meg was getting increasingly tired. Patrick was doing all that he could to help her. He would lay the table and get out what food they had and make sure that there was water for the kettle. He was only 4 years old, so his assistance was limited, but very much appreciated by Meg. Patrick was growing more and more in the image of his father, which was both a pleasure and sadness for Meg. She loved Liam, and she knew that she would until the day she died. But she now lavished all her thoughts and attention on Patrick. One afternoon, soon after Meg had got home from work, Colin knocked at her door. He had Michael with him, and also had brought a few vegetables and some eggs and milk for her. "Can I have a word with you, please, Meg?" asked Colin. "Perhaps we could get a breath of fresh air. Michael will stay with Patrick for a while." It was Meg's first instinct to refuse, but she could see how agitated Colin was, so she grabbed her coat and said that she would be back shortly. When they had left the room, Colin said that they could take a walk by the docks. It was a pleasant afternoon. "Meg, I wonder if you and your son would like to spend next Sunday with us on the farm. I'm sure that young Patrick would enjoy the change of scenery, and I know that I would enjoy showing you both around," said Colin. "I'm afraid that I'm not very good company, Colin," said Meg. "You know that I lost my wife at around the same time that you lost Liam, so we have very much in common. Also, I have a son, and so do you," said Colin. "I'm not trying to rush you into anything, but I would very much like it if we could become good friends and help one another through these difficult times." "We are good friends, Colin," said Meg. "I would enjoy seeing your farm, and I'm sure that Patrick would be very happy to see it. I can only be honest with you. I still love Liam, even though he is no longer with us, and I'm sure you feel the same way about your wife. But there is no reason why we cannot keep one another company on occasion. I'll come to fetch you on Sunday morning, and we can have lunch. But I must warn you that Michael and I can cook, but we do not have the feminine touches, although I am sure you will excuse that," said a very happy-looking Colin. They walked back to Meg's rooms, and she made tea for them, and apologised that she had no cake to offer them. Colin smiled and produced some biscuits from one of the packages that he had brought with him. Patrick was excited that he was going out for the day on Sunday. He had never been to a farm, and he began asking questions about it. There were several sheep and many chickens. They had a couple of cows for their milk, but the farm was mainly devoted to agriculture, and Colin was pleased to say that he did not rent the land, he owned it, which he seemed very proud to tell Meg about. "Is it Sunday yet, Mummy?" asked Patrick every day. When Sunday arrived, Michael took Patrick under his wing while Colin and Meg arranged lunch. Meg and Patrick went to the farm on many occasions over the following year, and on one visit Colin proposed to Meg. "We have a great deal in common, Meg. We get on well together. Our boys also get on well. This farm needs a woman's touch, and you know that I would always look after you. I know that you still have feelings for Liam, as I do for my wife. But we could have a good life together and give our boys stability," said Colin. "Can I think about it, please, Colin, because even thinking about it makes me feel disloyal to Liam. I suppose you also feel the same about your wife," said Meg. "It would be a much better life for young Patrick living here rather than in your room in town. And I'm not being critical. You are doing your best for him, but being together here would give him a great deal more freedom," said Colin. "I know what you are saying, but my main concern for Patrick is that he has a good education. I want him to make something of himself in older life," said Meg. "Yes, I would like Michael to go to school more regularly than he does at present. I promise you that I will ensure that Patrick has the best education possible, and when he finishes school we can make sure that he achieves whatever career he has in mind," said Colin. "What does Michael want to do?" asked Meg. "This is his life. He loves farming," said Colin. "It is not something that I have insisted upon. He just has a natural instinct for it." It took 3 weeks for Meg to make up her mind, and as she thought about it, the advantages outweighed the disadvantages. She didn't love Colin as she did Liam, but she loved her son, and she knew that Colin would be good to him and good to her. She was very fond of Michael, and she hoped that in time she would love Colin more than she did at present. Patrick would have a nice roof over his head, fresh air, a brother and a father figure, and most of all, Patrick would have the education that she had dreamed of for him. "Would you like to live at Uncle Colin's farm?" Meg asked Patrick. "What, forever?" asked Patrick. "If you like. What do you think?" asked Meg. "It would be nice to live with Michael. I think that he is like a big brother. I like seeing the animals. The house is quite big. Would I have my own bedroom?" asked Patrick. "Well, I'm not sure how many bedrooms there are, but you would have your own bed even if it is in with Michael," said Meg. It was Sunday, and Colin arrived to take Meg and Patrick for another day at the farm. He helped them into his buckboard. "Michael's looking forward to seeing you, Patrick," said Colin. "We have some new chicks which you can play with as long as you are careful." "Ooh," said Patrick. "I can see them every day when I come to live with you." Colin looked at Meg questioningly, and she smiled at him. "Yes, you can, Patrick. You can see them every day when you live with me," said Colin happily. "When is that going to happen?" asked Patrick. "Whenever your mother says that you can, although I know there is a lot to sort out first. But hopefully it won't be very long," said Colin. Patrick was sitting happily between his mother and Colin, and they made their way to the farm. Patrick kept the conversation going, but Meg was thoughtful, and Colin was nodding contentedly. When they arrived at the farm, Michael came to greet them, and Colin said that Patrick was excited to see the new chicks, and while he was doing that, his mother would help to get the dinner ready. Michael went off with Patrick, and Colin turned to Meg and said, "So you have made up your mind. You know that you have made me very happy. Can we tell Michael today? Obviously Patrick knows." "I asked if he would like to live with you and Michael at the farm, and he was very happy about it. I had to make sure that there would not be a problem with him, although I know that it is really our choice, but I do feel that children should be consulted to an extent when you are changing their lives for them," said Meg. "I am assuming that your offer of marriage is still what you would like, because I know that I would like us to do that." "Thank you, Meg. You know that you will make me very happy. I will stick to my promise to ensure that Patrick has the best education that we can afford, and hopefully that will let him follow his dreams," said Colin. "You can see that he and Michael get on well." Patrick did say that Michael would seem like a brother now. I hope that Michael feels the same way about him, said Meg. I believe that he does, and he has said on many occasions that it would be nice if you and Patrick were here permanently, said Colm. We have both had our sadnesses, but we can become a family and make our boys really happy, and ourselves, of course. When lunch was ready, and the boys sitting with them at the table, Colm announced that he and Meg would be getting married, and that they would all live happily at the farm. Will we be able to have food like this every day? Asked Patrick. Yes, every day, Patrick, smiled Colm. Michael was very quiet, and Meg thought that he was not quite so happy with the situation, and she gently asked him if he had a problem. But his problem was that he was so happy that he burst into tears. Meg got up and put an arm around him, and he cried even harder. He sniffed and mumbled that he was so happy and that it was just what he wanted, and he said how sorry he was that he was making a fool of himself. Meg wiped his eyes for him and kissed him on the head. You're not making a fool of yourself, Michael, said Colm. I know how you feel, as I feel the same. I don't cry when I'm happy, commented Patrick, as he put another piece of meat in his mouth and chewed on it thoughtfully. He couldn't understand why everyone was not eating lovely food, and he wasn't going to let it go to waste. You have the right idea, Patrick, said Colm. Food comes before all else. Patrick nodded in agreement. He couldn't talk as he had his mouth full, and he knew that it was rude to talk with your mouth full. Will you be all right at home all day tomorrow, Michael? Said Colm. I have quite a few things to organise, and it's best to get them arranged as soon as possible. I could stay and help him, said Patrick. I could look after the chicks for him. That's very kind of you, Patrick, but you need to be with your mother for a while, and when we are married, you will never have to leave here again, said Colm. Oh, all right, said Patrick, as he pushed a piece of potato into his mouth and chewed on that happily. He likes his food, doesn't he? Said Colm to Meg. Well, we don't have such good fare as this at home, only when you are kind enough to let us have some meat, and of course I can't cook that well on the fire that I have, but I do my best, and I know that I will be in my element in your kitchen, said Meg. It is now your kitchen, Meg. This is now your home, or will be soon, said Colm. Michael had now brightened up, and he too was enjoying his dinner. Patrick was very sleepy on the way home, and Colm said that Meg had made him very happy, and that she could see how happy she had made Michael. You had better start packing up your things, Meg, and I can gradually move them into our home. I have very little to bring with me, Colm, said Meg. Any money that I made had to go on food and material for clothes for Patrick. I'm afraid that I'm going to let you down on our wedding day. I have nothing very nice to wear for you. You know that I am not rolling in money, but I do have enough to make sure that we are both nicely dressed for our special day, said Colm. I didn't tell you that to make you buy me anything, said a dismayed Meg. They drew up outside her home, and he helped her down, and as Patrick was asleep, he lifted him into the room and laid him on the bed. Turning, he took her hand and noticed that she had removed her wedding ring. You have already taken your wedding ring off, said Colm. It was necessary. I needed the money, said Meg. I'm sorry I mentioned it. Do you want to get it back? Asked Colm. I didn't pawn it, Colm. I sold it. We needed some food, so it was the right thing to do. Feeding Patrick was more sensible than sentiment, said Meg. It's gone now, and was put to good use. It now seems better than it's sitting in a box in a drawer somewhere. We are starting out on a new life together, so it is best that it has gone. I understand that it must have been difficult for you, said Colm. It's the past, Colm, and it meant that Patrick did not have to go to bed on an empty stomach, said Meg, and Colm would never know how hard it had been for her to part with her wedding ring. She had a small gold cross and chain that Liam had bought her on their first anniversary, and that she had in line to sell next. But now she would not have to. She would hold on to it and give it to Patrick for whoever he chose as his wife. Her regret was that she had chosen the wedding ring to sell rather than the cross and chain. But wedding rings had always been in demand at that time. She would now be wearing another wedding ring, so perhaps she had chosen the right thing to do in the first place. Meg went to the houses where she cleaned and told them of her future plans. One of the ladies inquired further and asked what she would be wearing for her wedding. Well, Colm says that he may be able to afford for me to get some material so that I can make something better than I have, said Meg. The woman looked at her and said, "Come with me." She led her up to a bedroom and opened a wardrobe. These were my daughter's clothes. Choose what you would like for your wedding day. There is no use for them now. I just keep them for sentimental reasons. Let's put them to good use. It's what she would want. Of course, you may not wish to have them. You know that she died 2 years ago. No, I had no idea that you had lost your daughter. I am so sorry to hear that, said Meg. The lady smiled and pulled out a very attractive day dress. Take this one. She never managed to wear it, so it is new. Hopefully you won't think it bad luck. Here's another that she did not use. Take them both. You will probably have to alter them a little. Thank you so much. No, I don't think of it as bad luck. I can only think of it as kindness and very good luck. It was going to be a problem what I was going to wear, but I can now concentrate on what I can do to make Patrick look presentable, said Meg. I know you have had a sad time, Meg. Perhaps your life will now become better for you and your young son. I wish you well, said the lady. Meg clasped the dresses to her as she made her way home. Patrick had once again laid the table, and as she was checking what they would have to eat, Colm arrived carrying some cold pork and bread. Meg smiled at him and told Patrick to get the cups out and that they could now have some bread and meat with a cup of tea. I hope you have no objection, Colm, but one of the ladies that I work for has given me some new dresses that her daughter never had the chance to wear. I will wear one of them to our wedding, so you don't have to worry about me, said Meg. This will be the last time that you have to wear other people's cast-offs. I will make sure that I can provide for you and young Patrick in the future, said Colm. They are not really cast-offs, Colm. They had never been worn, and were sitting in a wardrobe gathering dust, said Meg. Colm smiled. Well, it is one problem solved. What will Patrick wear? I'm in the middle of making him an outfit. It will be ready in time, and he will look very smart, said Meg. We are going to have a good life, Meg, all 4 of us. You will not ever have to worry again. I may not be rich, but I can afford to keep us in food and clothing, said Colm. The wedding service seemed to be over very quickly, and it wasn't long before they all climbed into the buckboard and were on their way to the farm. Patrick was excited. He had previously inspected where he would be sleeping and was delighted to know that he had his own room. They had what could be considered high tea, after which Michael and Patrick changed out of their smart clothes and went to feed the chickens. Colm kissed Meg and said that he also had to change, as there were other animals that needed feeding. I'll also change and organise some supper for us, said Meg, and she happily looked around the kitchen. I can see that you can't wait to make this kitchen your own. I'm sure that there is much that you would like to arrange yourself, said Colm. It's all very nice, Colm. There is not much that needs altering. I'll get used to it in time. I know that we are all going to be very happy together, said Meg, and she hoped that she sounded more sincere than she felt. Meg could hear Michael and Patrick happily talking whilst they fed the chickens, and Colm was calling across to them. She watched through the window and could see how happy they all seemed, but she did not know how she was going to deal with what would be expected of her that night. Are we going to have more food? Asked Patrick when he came into the kitchen with Michael. Yes, Patrick, we will have supper when Colm comes in, said Meg. Is he now my daddy? Asked Patrick. He is going to look after you just as a father should, and if you want to call him daddy, I'm sure he would be pleased about that, said Meg. Well, I'm going to call you mother, said Michael. It's nice that I have a mother and father again. Colm walked in, and Patrick shouted triumphantly, Hello, Daddy! That's really nice to hear, Patrick, said Colm. Patrick excitedly ate his supper and asked if he could go to bed when he had finished. They all smiled at him, knowing that he couldn't wait to spend the night in his own room. When Patrick and Michael had gone to bed, Meg and Colm sat in the chairs either side of the fire and discussed the events of the day. You are looking very nervous, Meg, said Colm gently. We would take everything very slowly and get to know one another. The bedroom was warm and cosy, and Meg smiled at Colin and then closed her eyes and dreamed that it was Liam making love to her. She felt guilty, but was determined that Colin would never know her thoughts. Colin was not a fool. He realised that Meg was not enjoying their love-making. His first wife had been a very loving woman, so he knew that Meg was not reacting as he had hoped. But perhaps all would be well eventually. He loved Meg and was prepared to give her the time to settle. Time was passing, and Michael and Patrick attended school each day. Patrick enjoyed mixing with other children, and so did Michael, but he would have preferred to spend the time around the farm. Life settled in the family. There was always food on the table, clean clothes, and no worries about money. But Meg and Colin's love life was not idyllic. Meg tried very hard, but could not gain the feelings towards her husband that they both would have liked. Meg and Colin tried not to let their differences show to either Michael or Patrick, but there were occasions when there was a sharp word or two between them. However, over the next few years, Meg had several miscarriages, and Colin was always sorry that they had aired their differences, as he felt that it may have caused the loss of their child. No matter how hard he tried, Patrick did not have the ability to become a farmer. He helped around the place, especially with Michael, who tried to show him the good side of farming. Patrick appreciated that whatever work was done on the farm put food in their mouths and made money for clothes. During the school holidays, he went with Colin and Michael to the market in town, and he was good at getting people to buy from them. Colin smiled at him indulgently and always gave him some money to buy what he would like, but most times he chose something nice for his mother. Even though he had been very young, he remembered how hard his mother had worked just to put a little food on the table. The years were passing quickly, and Patrick was now 12 years old. He noticed that sometimes at night he could hear his mother choking and coughing very noisily. He often called out to make sure that she was all right, and Colin would answer that he was not to worry as he was looking after her. Michael often commented that Meg seemed to have a persistent cough, and perhaps she should see a doctor. "I am fine, Michael," Meg would say. "I have some cough medicine, and it makes me feel better." Meg started wearing a scarf around her neck, and Patrick said that it would probably make her throat less of a problem, and she nodded in agreement. On one of the occasions when Colin, Michael and Patrick were at their market stall, some of the men from the nearby army barracks were also in town. They walked past the stall, and then one of them turned and stared at Patrick. Colin caught sight of the man and asked what he wanted. "My apologies," he said, "but I thought that I recognised your boy. He looks just like a friend that I used to have many years ago. Are you by any chance relatives of Liam Kelly?" "He was my father. This is my father now," said Patrick innocently. Colin remained quiet as Ronan introduced himself. "You must be young Patrick. I haven't seen you since you were a very little boy. You are the image of your father. How is your mother?" "She is very well," interrupted Colin, and Ronan realised that Colin was not pleased to be reminded of Liam. "I am glad to hear that. Give my best wishes to your mother, Patrick. I am pleased to see you again after all this time," said Ronan, and he went on his way to join the other soldiers. "I don't really remember my father," commented Patrick, and he carried on helping to sell to the customers. The meeting with Ronan meant nothing to Patrick, and he would probably forget about it before he reached home. Colin looked at him thoughtfully. He had seen Liam in Meg's company many years ago, and he had forgotten what he looked like, but Ronan's saying that Patrick looked like his father stirred memories, and he had to admit that there was very little of Meg in him. It wasn't Patrick or Colin who told Meg of the encounter with Ronan. It was Michael. "Somebody said that Patrick looked like his father," said Michael innocently. "I had forgotten that my dad wasn't his father." Meg looked at him, frowned, and asked who had they been talking to. "He was a soldier called Ronan," said Michael. "Oh, yes, he sent his best wishes to you," added Patrick, as he carried on looking to see what they were having for supper. Nothing else was said until after the boys had gone to bed. "Who is Ronan?" asked Colin. "If it's who I think it is, he was a soldier in the same unit as Patrick's father," said Meg, who found it best not to mention Liam's name. He was sent to India many years ago, so I presume that he is now back. You knew him quite well then, commented Colm. Well, Liam did know him. They were good friends. He was the one who broke the news of his death to me, said Meg cautiously. I see, was all that Colm said. But Meg could see that he was not happy about the day's meeting with Ronan. There were several occasions over the following years that they met Ronan. He always acknowledged every member of the family and sent his best wishes to Meg. Patrick was beginning to take notice of Ronan and any soldier who was in his company. He asked questions about what it was like to be a soldier, and he seemed impressed by what he was being told. I think I would like to become a soldier, Patrick said one day to his mother. Meg was dismayed by Patrick's idea for a career. The army killed your father, so why do you want to follow in his footsteps? You must think again. You can have a good life staying here. There is more than enough work for you and Michael, as well as your father, said Meg. He's not my father, said Patrick. You know that I really don't like farming. I do it because it's needed, but I don't want to be a farmer. I want to be a soldier. You know that he has been a good father to you since you were a small boy. Michael treats you like a brother. We are a family, Patrick, and we should remain together, said Meg. Later, Meg spoke to Colm about the choice that Patrick wanted to make for his future. I've always known that farming wasn't for him, so I suppose we must encourage him to make the right choice of a career. I do wonder if the army is the correct choice for him, but I don't know what else he is capable of, said Colm. Patrick was now approaching 16 years old, but all his thoughts of an army career were put out of his head as his mother was showing signs of serious illness. Every now and again she was in such pain that she was unable to get out of bed. Other times she made it down to the living area and attempted to look after her family. This went on for nearly a year, until she took to her bed and would not allow Patrick or Michael to visit her. Colm attended to her needs every day, whilst Patrick and Michael ran the farm between them. As time went on, they could hear Meg crying out in pain. The doctor was giving her medicine to ease her pain, but it was having little effect. They all knew that she was dying, and they went about their business quietly, always listening to any sounds coming from the bedroom. Michael and Patrick were sitting at the table in the kitchen one evening, when they heard Meg cry out in pain again, and it was followed by her calling for Liam to help her. And then there was silence, followed by the sound of Colm crying. They buried her the following day, with Colm insisting that she was placed next to Liam Kelly. Michael queried why that should be, and Colm said that it was who she called for in her last moments, so it was right that she was now with him. Patrick was crying at the graveside, and Colm told him to stop and dry his eyes. Life goes on, he said harshly, and walked off towards the buckboard, which would take them back to the farm. Colm handed Patrick a package soon after they arrived home, and in it was a letter telling him the history of his beginnings and what had happened to his father all those years ago. Also in the package was a gold cross and chain, which had been given to his mother on the first anniversary of her marriage to Liam, and she wanted him to have something from his father. She asked him not to join the British Army, as it had never protected his father from violence in a time of peace. Colin went through a time of great annoyance. He showed a temper which had not appeared to be there whilst Meg was with him. Patrick knew that their marriage had not been one made in heaven, but they seemed to have got on reasonably well together. He realised that the love of her life had been his father, Liam, and he also realised that Colm had always known it. A year passed, and Patrick had spent the time helping around the farm, but it was obvious that he was not happy, and Colm decided to discuss their futures with both Michael and Patrick. I have always thought of you as my son, Patrick, and I think that we all got on well together here. You have proved that even though you are not a farmer, you have helped in every way that you can to keep this place going, along with Michael and myself. I know that you have a wandering spirit, and you feel that an army life would suit you. Indeed, it is what your father was. I promised your mother that I would make sure that you had a decent education, and because of that promise, I realised that I had lacked in encouraging Michael to have a good education. So I remedied that at the same time. I feel that your education could go a step further, said Colm. Patrick groaned, as he had visions that Colin was going to insist that he attends a college of some description. Colin smiled for the first time in many weeks. "Let me finish, Patrick," he said. "Your mother would be devastated if you enlisted in the British Army, especially as you are Irish. Your own people will set you apart as they did your father, so I'm going to suggest that you join the American Army, and I don't mean just enlisting. I mean that we can write to the military training school, and you will immediately become a lieutenant when you pass out of the academy. That will set you up for life. What do you think? And your comments, Michael, would be appreciated." "It's not something that I had considered, but it seems a suggestion well worth thinking about," said Patrick thoughtfully. "I do not like to think of Patrick going so far," said Michael. "He has been such a help to us, especially this last year, when I know that he has hated every minute of what he was doing. I also don't like the thought of him going into the British Army, and much as I never knew his father, I do know what happened to him because he was in the British Army. If he had been killed in some foreign battle, his death would have been much more acceptable. The American Army would be a perfect solution if it was not so far away. I feel that we will never see him again, and that saddens me greatly." "How would you manage here without me?" asked Patrick. "We have made this farm more profitable because we have been able to increase all sorts of fields, mainly potatoes, I know, but we do dabble in some different vegetables, which go down well at the market. I would try to find some young lad to live in. He would have board and lodging and a small salary. Your mother taught us all how to cook certain food, so I'm sure we could cope," said Colin. Patrick laughed. "We must make sure that whoever you get in is quite capable of washing up. You know that it is something that none of us are very good at." "Our farmhouse is near enough to town for some girl to come in every now and again to keep us in order," said Colin. "I'm sure that it won't be too long before Michael thinks of marriage, which would solve that problem." "I'm not going to marry somebody just because we need someone to wash up," said Michael. "At the moment we manage our washing, just about," said Patrick. "We will have to seriously think about that if you go to America, because you are the one who keeps us clean." "Well, at least you suggest that we wash our clothes and bed linen," smiled Colin. "The idea does appeal to me, but I do have my reservations about leaving you. I may not have said it before because I have always felt that this is my family, but you made me feel part of it, and I know that my mother and I were in a difficult situation before you came on the scene, and I do appreciate all that you have done for me and my mother. Latterly, I have been under no illusions that your marriage was not all it could have been, and that my birth father clouded my mother's life with you. But you still treated me as your son, and Michael always treated me as a brother. I have been very lucky," said Patrick. "I loved your mother, Patrick, and she was good to me and Michael. I wish that I could have made her love me. If I had achieved that, then I know she would have had a much better life. It was very frustrating on occasion, but let's not go into that. We must decide all our futures soon," said Colin. "Do you have contacts regarding how I get into the American Army?" asked Patrick. "I have made the proper inquiries, but there is no rush. Think about it seriously. All I will add is that you are still underage, and you would need my permission to join, and I would not give that to you if you wish to join the British Army. What you do when you are of age, I would not be able to stop, but at the moment I do have that power, and I would use that power for your mother's sake," said Colin. "I understand. I have a great deal to think about, so I'll go to my room if you have no objections," said Patrick, and he made his way up to his room and lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, because sleep eluded him that night. Michael asked Patrick on many occasions if he had come to a decision about going to America. Colin was more reluctant to question. Patrick always said that it was a very big decision, and at times he asked Colin questions about how he would get to America, and where the military academy was, and how he would achieve being able to enroll. "I have spoken to someone from the American embassy, and we can book an appointment to see the representative from the army when he next visits, which will be in a couple of months. And you can enroll that way, and he would tell us all that is needed. What I do know is that you must provide your own uniform, and we can get that made here. They have standard specifications for that, and you can add to it. I would suggest that we get 2 made for you. Once you are there, working uniforms are provided. but you will need the nicer ones that you will have with you, as there will initially be functions that you will have to attend, which will also happen wherever you are posted. So we can set you up smartly before you leave here, said Colm. You seem to have gone into it in detail. I would have thought that some idea of the type of duties I would be expected to undertake would be more of a priority than what uniform I have, said Patrick. Going to the academy is quite an upper-crust establishment, and I don't want you to look out of place. The way you have been educated sets you in good stead to talk to anyone. But if you don't look smart, you could be targeted by those who think they are above others. You can hold your head up in any company. You have an intelligence that you have not yet put to good use, and also I know that you are not shy in front of anyone. I know that you will make an exceptionally good soldier, and it is probably what you were born to do. But not here, and not in the British Army, said Colm. I see, said Patrick. But I really would like to know what sort of duties I would be undertaking. I'm afraid that is something that I know nothing about, and it is something that you will find out from the Army representative when you meet him in a couple of months' time, said Colm. I have to think of all the questions that I want to know the answers to between now and then, said Patrick. I'll help you with that, Patrick, said Michael. I suppose you'll have to fight Red Indians. That is going to be very dangerous. From what I hear, they have mostly been tamed, commented Colm. That's disappointing, said Patrick. Over the following 2 months, Patrick asked so many questions that neither Michael nor Colm could answer. He carried on helping on the farm and attempting to keep the house as clean as possible. Both he and Michael noticed that Colm's temper was getting worse. Everything was becoming an annoyance to him. Michael had started talking about a girl from the village, and finally he plucked up the courage to ask her out. After their first date, Michael confided in Patrick that he really liked the girl and hoped that she felt the same. What's her name? Asked Patrick. Jessica O'Reilly, said Michael. The O'Reillys run the grocery shop, don't they? Said Patrick. Yes, they are very busy people, and they have 3 daughters. Jessica is the middle daughter. She's very pretty, said Michael. I've noticed that all the girls are very pretty, but especially the middle one, added Patrick diplomatically. Patrick was very calm when he finally met the enrolment officer at the embassy. Some would have been awestruck by the surroundings, but Patrick was not. He had expected it to be lavish, as America was not a poor country. He got on well with the army officer, and finally the soldier said that Patrick was exactly what the army needed. He seemed impressed that Patrick's father had been a soldier and sympathised because his father had died. I'm surprised that you are not enlisting in the British Army, said the officer, and Patrick told him that both he and his stepfather felt that after what had happened to his father, the British Army was not for him, and he had promised his mother that he would not enlist, and even though she was dead, he could not go back on that promise. What battle did your father die in? I did not think that the British were in any real conflicts for many years, said the officer. I'm afraid that my father was murdered by his own people. The Irish do not like the British Army, and even though he was in an Irish regiment, a rabble attacked the barracks in Dublin, and several soldiers were killed, my father being one of them, said Patrick. I can see that the army is in your blood, Patrick, and understand that a new life in America would suit you well. I think that you will become a credit to the army, and I see that you keep your promises. The army life is not an easy route to take. I will not lie to you. It can be very hard, and there could be dangers around every corner. We have problems brewing on the Mexican border. We still have savages to control, and we also have some of the dregs of many countries turning up in our land. I know that the Irish despise the British Army, and to your cost they are quite capable of murder. But there are not the dangers here that you may encounter in America. When you have thought about all of that, hopefully you will be able to make the correct decision, said the officer. I have made the correct decision, and I would like to be considered for enrolment in the military training academy, said Patrick. The next course would not be taking place for 5 months, which would give Patrick time to prepare. It would also give Colm time to get some help around the farm. Uniforms were to be made, and sailing times had to be sorted out. Patrick made his way home after his meeting and broke the news that he was definitely going to emigrate and join the American army. Colm just grunted his approval. Michael was quite sad about it, but having a nice girlfriend like Jessica was making it a little easier for him. Surprisingly, Colm gave Patrick quite a sum of money and told him to make his own arrangements. "I thought that you would like to help me get organised," said Patrick to Colm. "No, you've made your decision. You now have your life planned, and Michael and I have ours. I'm sure you will be able to sort everything yourself. I would like you to move into Michael's room with him this weekend, as I will need your room for a new helper," said Colm grumpily. Michael looked just as surprised as Patrick. "I remember the day I moved in here," said Patrick. "I couldn't wait to go to bed, as it was the first time that I had a room of my own and a bed of my own." Colm just shrugged and left to carry out some task around the farm. Michael was frowning, and at last he said, "I'll help you with that, Patrick. I presume that he doesn't want you to go to sleep on the floor. We don't have another bed. I'll have a word with him. I'm sure we don't have anyone starting here yet." The outcome was that Michael and Patrick would move into the larger double bedroom, and Colm would move into one of the single rooms. But he had agreed that there was no point until they had a worker in mind. "Besides, you will need the larger room when you marry," Colm said to Michael. "I haven't made any plans in that respect yet," said Michael. "Well, you had better think about it," grumbled Colm. "He seems to be getting worse," said Patrick to Michael one day when they were working out in one of the fields. "Yes, it seems to be since your mother left us," said Michael. "He is also probably going to miss you. I know that I will." "I'm beginning to think that he really can't wait for me to leave," said Patrick. "I don't know what's in his mind. He keeps his thoughts very much to himself," said Michael. Patrick's passage was booked. He had gone to the Marchant and Fuller offices at the dockside and sorted out a suitable date to travel, which would mean that he would be well in time for the beginning of the course at the academy. The ship would be stopping at the nearest port to Dublin, and then go on to Southampton before heading across the Atlantic to New York. He had the luxury of a small cabin below decks, so at least he would have some privacy. He knew that he would only be allowed on deck at specific times, so that passengers did not get in the way of the sailors. He would be provided with food in a communal dining area, whereas many of the lower deck passengers had to bring their own food. Patrick did wonder how such food would be kept fresh for those passengers, but it was not his problem. He went into Belfast with Colm 3 weeks before he was due to leave Belfast. He had to collect his uniforms that day, and he wanted to go to the army barracks and let Ronan know when he was leaving. He had not seen him very often, but he knew that he would be interested in the future that Patrick had mapped out for himself. Colm was busy on the stall, but he was coping, so Patrick firstly made his way to the tailor's, tried on the uniforms and happily left, carrying the packages. He came out of the tailor's and looked towards the stall where Colm was talking to young Jessica O'Reilly, and he hoped that he was being kind to her. He was about to turn towards the army barracks when he noticed that Jessica looked distressed and had begun running away towards her home. "I suppose he said something gruff to her," thought Patrick. No doubt Michael would be able to ease the situation. Ronan came out to greet Patrick and was surprised to hear that he would be leaving for America shortly, but delighted that he had chosen to follow his father into an army career. "You'll do well in that, Patrick," said Ronan. "You are suited to that life, just as your father was. America is a long way away, and I'm sorry to see you go, but wish you the best of luck. I know you will do well." Patrick made his way back to the stall and said that he had seen young Jessica O'Reilly there. "She's a silly girl," mumbled Colm, which was all he said on the subject. They were both very quiet on the way home. Michael asked if they had seen Jessica whilst they were in town, and Patrick said that he had only seen her from a distance. He believed that Colm had seen her, but Colm was in an extremely miserable mood, so Michael did not touch on the subject. "I have planned to see her tomorrow, so I'll find out what was said," said Michael. The next day Michael returned home from his planned meeting with Jessica, upset and confused. "Her parents wouldn't let me see her. They said they didn't want her to associate with anyone from our family. She had someone better who was interested in her." Patrick wondered whether it was whatever Colm had said to her the previous day. "I thought you and she were getting on so well. I am sorry, Michael. I know that you were hopeful about getting together with Jessica. Perhaps you'll be able to sort it all out with her." "Not according to her parents," said Michael unhappily. The next week, Colm and Michael set up their stall, but when they returned to the farm, they still had a great deal of produce that had not sold. "I don't know what happened," said Michael. "None of our usual customers bought from us. They totally ignored us. I hope that doesn't happen again. They seem to want us to leave." Colm walked in at that moment and Patrick turned on him. "What did you say to Jessica last week? It must have been something dreadful for everyone to turn on us. You had better apologise for whatever you said." "I said nothing that should have upset her or her family. She's a silly little girl, and really you need a stronger person as a wife," Colm said to Michael, and he left the room slamming the door after him. "We still have to find someone to help out here. I don't think that my father has done anything about it," said Michael. "I think there would be many willing hands at the orphanage. Many would jump at the opportunity of a room and board and a small wage. The work can be hard on some occasions, but not all the time. Perhaps you should suggest it to him," said Patrick. "Why don't you?" said Michael. "It's no longer my business, Michael. That has been made abundantly clear to me," said Patrick. "This used to be a happy house when your mother was here," said Michael. "It seems to be a place of misery now." "It will now be up to you to change that, Michael. I'm afraid that there is nothing that I can do about it," said Patrick. "I'll go with you to the market next week. We'll see if it's your father who has created the problem in town. Meanwhile, we have a lot of vegetables to eat." Michael smiled for the first time in a while, and he said, "We had to do that a great deal in the past." "So did my mother and I," said Patrick. "That was through the kindness of your father. I will not forget that." The next week, Michael and Patrick set up the stall in town, and although custom was not quite so brisk, they did sell a great deal of their produce. Michael hoped that he would be able to see Jessica, but she stayed well out of sight. "It seems that we must keep father away from town for a while. He obviously said something outrageous to Jessica, and no doubt someone will tell me what it is eventually," sighed Michael. Colm thought that approaching the orphanage was a good idea, so he and Michael called there the following day. There were several boys who seemed to be ideal for the work at the farm, and Colm left it to Michael to decide who would be best suited. Michael asked Patrick to go with him the following day, although Patrick had pointed out that it was no longer his business. Michael said that he would appreciate his thoughts on it anyway. There were 3 young lads, and they relaxed in Michael's and Patrick's company, although one was a little sullen, and Patrick felt that it was just a means of getting out of the orphanage for him. The other 2 were suitably keen, but finally they decided on one boy. But Michael said that he would not be needed for 10 days, and in that time they would get his room ready for him. They talked to the head of the orphanage, and he arranged for them to have some refreshments, which were brought in by 2 girls, one of whom was exceedingly pretty, and Patrick could see that Michael was quite interested in her. Her name was Deirdre, but she had no surname. "I wonder if it would be permitted to walk out with Deirdre, that is, if she is agreeable to it," Michael asked the head of the orphanage. "We try to look after our young girls. Approaches are often made which could be detrimental to their well-being. I hope that your interest is in contemplating a decent future for her, if indeed she is agreeable to your approach," said the man. "I understand what you are saying, and I would do nothing to damage the young lady's reputation," said Michael. "The young lady is in the kitchen if you would like to ask her," said the head. "I'll wait for you in the buckboard," smiled Patrick as they left the room. Michael was very pleased with himself when he joined Patrick. "I gather that she said yes," smiled Patrick. "She did, Patrick," said Michael. "I'll call for her tomorrow afternoon, and we can spend an hour or 2 together, and we'll see how we get on." "Keep her away from your father as long as possible," said Patrick. "You know that all he thinks of in a wife for you is somebody who can slave away at the farm. You don't want to frighten her off." "That's good advice, Patrick," said Michael. "I don't know what he said to Jessica, but it must have been something very upsetting for her and for her family. I won't tell him who I am seeing, always assuming that Deirdre and I do get on well together." "Good luck with that, Michael. She did seem very nice, and being in a place like that must be rather depressing for her. At least you'll be able to show her that there is another side to life," said Patrick. The day arrived when Patrick was leaving. The ship was sailing on the evening tide, so he was getting to the docks during the afternoon. The young lad arrived that morning with his meagre possessions, and Patrick was pleased to see that Colin had greeted him warmly and showed him up to what had been Patrick's room. They had arranged that a stew was on the stove, which would be ready for the evening meal, but Patrick would be long gone by then. Patrick's stomach was churning, and he could see that Michael was feeling the same. As the time approached for him to leave, Colin came to him and said that he was not good at saying goodbye and would like to bid him farewell there and leave it to Michael to drive him to the docks. "I can show the young lad around the farm. It will keep me occupied," said Colin, and he handed Patrick a package and told him not to open it until he reached his cabin. He then called the boy, and he marched out of the farmhouse and did not look back. Patrick stared after him in surprise, and then he looked at Michael, who was equally surprised. "Let's get going," said Michael, and they drove in silence to the docks. When they arrived, they stayed in the buckboard for a short while. "I don't know what to say, Michael," said Patrick. "It may not be the last time that we meet. I hope that we do see one another again. I know that you will write when you have the time, and I will write and give you an address. When you go on board, I'm going to see Deirdre," said Michael. "She knows that this is going to be a difficult day for me. I haven't told my father about her yet. I shall leave that as long as possible. He is going to be busy with the new lad. I've forgotten his name. It's Finn. I'm not sure of his surname." "I don't know if anyone has a surname coming from the orphanage," commented Patrick. As Patrick stepped down from the buckboard, he turned and saw that Ronan had come to see him off. "Good luck, Patrick," said Ronan. "I hope you have a safe journey. I know that you are going to achieve a great deal in America. It would be good to hear from you on occasion." "I shall be keeping in touch with the family, and I will also drop you a line or two," said Patrick. "Goodbye, Patrick. You are very like your father. He was a good man, a good husband, a good father, and a good soldier," said Ronan, and he shook hands and left. Michael clasped Patrick to him, and then he climbed aboard the buckboard and quickly drove away, leaving Patrick to climb the gangway alone and fighting back the tears which he knew Michael was also trying not to shed. A sailor came forward, took his name, and guided him towards his small cabin. He was lucky, as it was not so far from the hatch, so there would be some fresh air to be had. He unpacked all that he would need for the voyage, and then opened the package from his stepfather. It contained a note that just said this should help towards his future. It wasn't signed, and when Patrick looked closely, he found $100 American there. Patrick stared at the money and realised how confusing his stepfather really had been. He could almost be considered two different people. He then decided to make his way to the dining room, which doubled as a sitting room for the second-class passengers. There were a couple of people sitting there, and a sailor said that the dinner wouldn't be until they were underway. Patrick nodded and picked up a newspaper and tried to concentrate on the news of the day. There seemed to be a great deal of noise going on, and Patrick assumed that they were getting ready to sail. One of the sailors came in and said that if they wished, they could go on deck and watch their ship leave port. He would show them the best place to be, so that it did not interfere with the smooth running of the ship. Patrick watched as they cast off, and he looked at the dockside and could see Michael standing there with Deirdre at his side. And further back was Ronan. They were all quietly watching as the ship slowly left the dock. Patrick waved, but he was not sure that they could see him. A lump grew in his throat, and he decided to quickly go to his cabin, where he could make a fool of himself in private. When they were underway, a sailor called them for dinner, and Patrick made his way to the dining room, although he was not very hungry. It seemed that everyone felt a little like Patrick. Leaving his home and his country was a very big step. Sleep was not easy that night. The bed was not very comfortable, but no doubt he would get used to it in time. Luckily he was a good sailor, but he could hear others suffering seasickness, and he hoped that they would not be afflicted throughout the journey. They docked near Dublin the next day, and there was a small influx of passengers. A young man moved into the cabin next to Patrick's, and he looked quite sad. As Patrick made his way up to the dining room at lunchtime, the young man seemed lost, and Patrick smiled and introduced himself. The young man was Sean Byrne. and he was setting out on a new life. They sat together at the table, and Patrick asked what Sean was planning to do when he got to America. "I have no real plans. There could be 1 or 2 businesses that I will be able to invest in," said Sean. "Why are you going to America? You could do that in Ireland or England." "It's a big trip just to invest in some business," said Patrick. "I'm a 3rd son, and I don't follow the family tradition. In fact, they seem to think that I'm an embarrassment to them. My 2 brothers knew exactly what they wanted to do in life, but whatever was suggested to me did not appeal. I have enjoyed all forms of sport, but my father thought that I should go into some form of accountancy or banking," said Sean. "Families can be difficult." "Did you not have someone to care for?" said Patrick. "I did, but that was not approved of," said Sean. "I see," said Patrick, but he really didn't. He would not have let anyone dictate to him who he could or couldn't see. Sean smiled, as he could see what Patrick was thinking. "It was no hardship, Patrick. It really wasn't a good match. Just someone whose company I enjoyed. What do you have planned?" "I am enrolled in the military academy. I am going to make the army my career," said Patrick proudly. "Why in America?" asked Sean, and Patrick told him of his father's demise and the promise to his mother. "My stepfather arranged that I join the military academy, and when I have finished, I will be a lieutenant, or should I say lieutenant. He said that he would not allow me to be an enlisted private, and he somehow got me an interview with the recruitment officer who was visiting Belfast. So I enrolled there and then, and the new course is starting in 7 weeks' time, which will give me plenty of time to reach New York, and I'm sure I will find an adequate hotel to stay in the meantime," said Patrick. "Your stepfather seems to be a very generous man," said Sean. "If you met him, you would not have thought so, but you are right, he has been very generous," said Patrick, with a puzzled look on his face. He didn't want to boast about the money that Colm had handed to him on the day that he left, but Patrick had no worries about living between landing in New York and the start of the academy. "I envy you, Patrick," said Sean. "You are very clear on what you want in life. I wish I had such plans for my future." Sean and Patrick were often seen in deep conversation, and they found that they had a great deal in common. They also found that they each seemed to know what the other was thinking on occasion. One day Sean came up to Patrick, but before he could say what was on his mind, Patrick butted in and said, "You're thinking of joining the army also, aren't you, Sean?" "I am, if it is possible. I know that you are very enthusiastic about what you are going to do, but I know that you are working in the dark about the academy and what your final duties will be, so you haven't blinded me with what you will be doing," said Sean. "You are right. I couldn't tell you what I don't know, but I know that it is going to be right for me," said Patrick. "I believe that it is also going to be right for me," said Sean. "I wonder if I would be able to enroll in the same course that you'll be on. If not, the next one will be some months away, if not years." "Well, Sean, if you are really serious about that, there will be only one way to find out, and that will be to visit the military academy directly we land in New York and see if there are any vacancies on the course. There is some cost involved. Do you have money for that?" asked Patrick. Sean smiled. "Money will not be a problem. Well, if you do manage it, I know that you need a dress uniform, which you will have to provide yourself, and as I happen to have 2 of them with me, and you are around the same size, that will be one problem solved," smiled Patrick. "That's very kind of you, Patrick, but I'm sure I could get one made in time," said Sean. "I don't really need to, and it would be one thing that you don't have to worry about," said Patrick. "When we know what we are doing, we can both get another made for us." The more Sean thought about the idea, the more he felt that it was right for him, and he hoped that he could enroll in the same course as Patrick, as he knew that they would work well together. Both Patrick and Sean were excited to see New York come into sight, and after they had docked, they made their way to a small hotel that had been recommended by the first mate, and luckily there were 2 small rooms available. Patrick knew how long he would need the room, and they hoped that it would be the same for Sean. Once they had settled and unpacked, it was evening, and an evening meal had been prepared for them. They got directions to the academy, which was just on the outskirts of town, and they knew that they would have to take a cab there the following day. It was with a great deal of relief that Sean was accepted at the academy, and he was briefed on what would be expected of him. The course was not starting for a couple of weeks, so Patrick and Sean had the opportunity to explore New York and the surrounding area. There were some ladies that they showed an interest in, but both wanted to concentrate on their future careers. There would be time enough later to gain some lady friends. Sean and Patrick proved to be excellent marksmen and horsemen. Neither enjoyed marching very much, but they recognised that it was part of army training. But they both really couldn't wait to get onto the shooting range. They competed against each other, but their trainer could find no difference between their skills. Riding was the same. They both had an instinct about how to get the best out of their mounts. Finally, they took the lieutenant's examinations, and both passed with flying colours. And as they dressed for the presentation, followed by a relaxing gathering, their dress uniforms showed them off as the handsome men that they were. They were both unaware of how their good looks were being remarked upon by the ladies who were guests that evening. Somehow they managed to dance quite well, considering neither had been trained in that art. When the authorities at the academy began to allocate posts for their new lieutenants, it was suggested that Sean and Patrick be posted together. They worked so well together that it would be a shame to split them up, and I feel that they would be an asset and a force to be reckoned with, said their main tutor. There are some soldiers who are excellent because they know how to look out for one another, and they almost know what is needed without being told or asked. I think we have that in Lieutenant Byrne and Lieutenant Kelly, said the head of the academy. What posts do we have that need 2 new lieutenants? Yes, we have an opening in Indian Territory, said a sergeant. It will be a risk putting 2 very new lieutenants in such a dangerous area, but I think that they will be able to handle it. The major there is good at ensuring that the men are well trained. It was a long journey to the Indian Territory. They were heartily fed up with the stage journey, and then the final part was by wagon to the fort, which had no towns nearby. They were very tired when they arrived, and happy to share a room, and although the beds were rather hard, anything was better than the journey to get there. During that journey, I began to wonder whether we had made the right decision over our choice of career, said Sean. I know that this is a little isolated, but I think that it is going to be quite exciting and will set us up well for the future, said Patrick. I don't think that we will be here for the rest of our lives. The next morning they reported to the Major's office and were given the duty of going out on a local patrol which would familiarise them with the surrounding area. Over the course of the next couple of years, they led patrols to many Indian encampments, mostly looking for white captives, and they managed to persuade them to release their prisoners. They picked up a smattering of the various Indian languages, but not enough to be without an interpreter. Their shooting, riding, and general army skills were becoming second to none. They had both found their vocation in life, and were moved to various posts where their skills were needed. They made quite a name for themselves, and then they were sent to the Mexican border as there were skirmishes going on there. It was the first time that they had been placed in a battle situation, and not only did they handle it well, but they also had to admit that they enjoyed it. The women in the cantinas were throwing themselves at all the soldiers, but Sean and Patrick were very choosy. They had seen too many soldiers in uncomfortable difficulties after sleeping with some of the women. Instead, they drank excessively for a while, but Patrick realised that he became very aggressive when he had consumed whisky or other spirits. He was quite even-tempered on beer or wine, although wine was not his drink of choice. There were times when they got close to young ladies, but it seemed that before any definite commitments could be made, they went their separate ways, although Patrick did get very close to it on one occasion. Michael had written to him a few times, and when his letters caught up with him, they told him that he and Deirdre had married and settled at the farm. Young Finn had turned out well. Colin was as grumpy as usual. Over the course of several years, Michael and Deirdre had 2 boys, Brendan and Colin, named after his grandfather, and Patrick was pleased that Michael was now a family man. Sean never heard from his family, which did not seem to bother him, but he was always interested in what Patrick's family were doing. Sean and Patrick now had their own troop. They were not allied to any particular army post, as they had the task of finding missing people, so they had to go to various Indian tribes and negotiate for the release of any captive that may be there. They then had to take them to the nearest fort, and from there they were taken to their families if they had any. It was hard work, but quite rewarding. They were very popular men and known in various army posts in many American states. A letter caught up with Patrick at one of the army posts, and it contained the sad news that Deirdre had taken her own life. It was a puzzle to Patrick, as Michael's previous letter was full of happiness about his wife and children. But Patrick had noticed that he had not mentioned Colum, and he wondered whether he had had anything to do with Deirdre's obvious unhappiness. From what you have told me about your stepfather, it seems possible that he created a miserable atmosphere in the household. You were very fond of Michael, weren't you? Said Sean. He welcomed me into the family and became a true brother to me. He looked out for me and encouraged me in everything that I did. I know that I'd tried to do the same for him, but he was older, and that made him the carer, said Patrick. Sadly, there is nothing that I can do to help. All I can do is write to express my true sympathy. Yes, it's very sad. I'm surprised that she committed suicide. Surely that is against her religion, said Sean. Even if it is, I'm sure that she didn't know what she was doing. She must have had a brainstorm at the time. It's unusual for a mother to leave her children in that way, said Patrick. No doubt eventually Michael would tell you how it all came about, said Sean. Patrick and Sean had been working with very little break for nearly 10 years. They had just got back from a particularly difficult mission, and they were tired, and their enthusiasm was currently lacking. I think the time has come for us to take a back seat for a while, said Patrick. We need a break, and perhaps we could be assigned to a fort that would allow us to take out small local patrols for a short while. You are right, Patrick. If we don't slow down a little, we are going to make some mistakes, and that will be to our cost and anyone else who may be with us, said Sean. I think that we should see the Major tomorrow and see what we can sort out. I suppose it's about time we settle down. You never know, we might find some suitable ladies and become boring married men, laughed Patrick. They saw the Major the following day, and they were told that it would be looked into. He appreciated that perhaps the time had come when they deserved slightly lighter duties for a while, but in the meantime there was a report that a white man had been seen with an Indian tribe, and they were assigned to investigate to make sure that the man was quite happy to be living with them. They were away from the fort for a week. They found that the man had made his home with the Indians, so nothing needed to be done for him, and they returned to the fort, and Patrick found that a letter had arrived for him from Michael. Sean was always interested in Patrick's news from Ireland, although neither of them thought of Ireland as their country any longer. How is your brother? Sean asked, because he had realised how close Patrick had been to Michael at one time. He is still finding it difficult to understand why Deirdre took her own life. It's been well over a year since that happened, said Patrick. Apparently the old man is getting worse, and the lad that they took on when I left is talking about going elsewhere, which is a shame, as I know that Michael was quite impressed with him. I suppose he's not really a lad any longer. We've been here over 10 years, so he must be well into his 20s now. Michael says that neither of them can do any good in the eyes of the old man, and the young boys are keeping out of their grandfather's way most of the time. I guess they also miss their mother. I think it must be more than 2 years since you heard about Michael's wife, said Sean, and Patrick had to agree with him. I hope Michael finds someone else to love, but I doubt it whilst the old man is still around. I wonder how the boys are really coping. The atmosphere in the farmhouse must be daunting. I certainly made the right decision coming here, said Patrick. Yes, I know that we need a short time to unwind at present, but I wouldn't change the decision to come to America, and I wouldn't change following you into the army, smiled Sean. A few weeks later, word reached them that there was an opening for them both at an army post near a town called Benson, and they should prepare to make their way there when they had finished their assignments locally. That sounds just what we're looking for, said Sean. It would be nice to have some time in a sleepy little town. Not much goes on in towns like that. I wonder if we'll find it too boring for us. With our experience, if we do find that we need more excitement, I know that we will be reassigned to somewhere livelier again, said Patrick. It was another month before they arrived at the fort at Benson, and they were greeted by Captain Graves, who, although they had met him and remembered him from their time on the Mexican border, he did not recognize them, so they did not mention it. A young lieutenant arranged for them to be shown to their quarters, and he said that he would come and show them around when they had unpacked and settled. His name was Ben Webber, and he seemed very pleasant. The fort seemed very well organized, and Ben said that he would introduce them to the colonel the following day, and then he would take them into the town, where they would meet several of the citizens who always were interested in those from the fort, and they would be made very welcome. Their quarters were very comfortable, and that night they discussed whether it had been a good idea to come to Benson, and they decided that they needed the rest, and so far they had found it very friendly. It's a long time since we have been this close to a town. I'm looking forward to going there tomorrow, said Sean. They met Colonel Weston first thing the following day, and as they left his office, the colonel's wife was waiting to greet them. She introduced herself, and they warmed to her. I trust your quarters are comfortable, said Ada Weston, but if there is anything that you need, just let Ben know and I'll make sure that you have it. They thanked her, and she commented that she knew that Ben was going to show them around the town shortly. You'll enjoy that. I may see you there later. B. Marshall and I have been planning a trip, and we always end up at Kathy's and Joe's shop for coffee and their delicious cakes. I hope you're not watching your waistlines, as it would be impossible if you are. Patrick and Sean smiled, as they had never had to watch their waistlines. They had been so busy over the past years that they had never had to worry about putting on weight. They had yet to be allocated their mounts, but Ben said that it was just a short walk to town, and the weather was particularly mild for the time of year. So they set out, and when they arrived, they were surprised to see just how busy it was. Ben was describing who and what was where, but Patrick was not listening, as he had caught sight of the most beautiful woman that he had ever seen, and even though she was on the opposite sidewalk, she had looked across, and he had seen the flash of her magnificent, gentle, green eyes, which seemed filled with kindness and laughter. She was walking and chatting to several people, but mostly to a particular young man, who was obviously happy to be with her. But Patrick could see that she was being kind to him, rather than encouraging him. He asked Ben who she was, and he could see that Ben pretended not to know who he was talking about. Patrick couldn't take his eyes off her, and he said to Ben, "You know who I mean." "That's Mrs. Murcher, or Marchant, or Marcher. I can never get her name right," said Ben. "Oh, she's married," said a very disappointed Patrick. Ben looked at him and knew that Patrick was someone who would treat a lady with respect. "I should have said that she is the widow Murcher." "That's good," said Patrick, and realised what he had said. "I don't mean that I am pleased that her husband is dead." And then he thought about it and said, "Well, yes, I am." "Don't worry, Patrick, I'll introduce you to Liza soon enough. I can see that she is busy at the moment, but I will arrange for you to meet her. You will anyway, as she often visits the fort and is very good friends with the colonel's wife and the captain's wife," said Ben. "Perhaps we could meet her now," said Patrick, but as he said that she disappeared into a shop, and the moment had passed. Sean had never seen Patrick so taken with anyone, and he had to admit that the lady did stand out in a crowd. Later they ended up at Kathy and Joe's general store, and did have coffee and delicious cakes. "Has Liza been in to see you today, Kathy?" asked Ben. "She did pop in earlier, but she is still helping Angus and Danny to sort out some of their filing, so she wasn't here long," said Kathy. "No doubt she'll be out to the fort in the next couple of days," said Ben. "I want to introduce Patrick and Sean to her, but obviously not today." When Patrick, Sean and Ben arrived back at the fort later that day, they were called into the colonel's office, and the captain was there also. "We have heard that there is a problem with one of the tribes who have just reached our patrolling area, and the word is that they have a couple of captives with them. I know that you have barely arrived here, but we do need you to investigate the situation and release the captives, if indeed there are any. I have arranged that our best scout goes with you, and that you also take 6 men with you," said Colonel Weston. It's getting late in the year, so if you think that you won't be able to find them before the winter sets in, come back and start again when the weather eases," said Captain Marshall. "I understand that you have yet to choose your horses. You had better do that now. Lieutenant Webber will advise you on that, and when you have chosen, I would suggest that he goes out with you so that you can get used to them, and they can get used to you." They saluted and left with Ben, making their way towards the corral. Ben showed them which horses could be available to them, and when they had made their choice, they went to the stables and found suitable saddles, and the three of them went on a short ride until they felt quite happy with their choices. When they returned to the fort, they unsaddled their mounts and rubbed them down, which was another way to familiarise themselves with the horses. They then went to the dining room and had their supper and arranged with the cook what they would need with them the following day. Bandor, the scout, came in and joined them, and Ben introduced him. Both Patrick and Sean were quite impressed with him, and they said that they looked forward to working with him. He just grunted his approval and left. Next, Ben had to make them aware of the men who had been chosen to go with them, and by the time they had finished they felt the need for sleep, especially as they would be leaving early the next morning. "Well, Patrick, so much for coming to a sleepy little town to relax," said Sean. "This is a bustling fort, and the town seems to be the same. I didn't expect to be going out on a mission so soon after arriving, but that's the army for you." "Yes, it seems a very nice town. I'm looking forward to returning." "She is lovely, isn't she?" said Patrick. Sean was tempted to say who, but he knew exactly who Patrick was talking about. "Yes, the widow, Liza Marchant, is very lovely, and you'll be able to get to know her when we get back. I'm sure she'll be pleased to know you." Sean, Patrick and their troop were away from Benson for nearly 3 weeks. They had sorted out the tribe who had the reported captives with them. Some had been with them so long that it was their choice to remain. Others they took to the nearest town, and the local sheriff took over and made sure that they were taken care of. A tired and dirty troop arrived back at Benson 2 days before Christmas, and after they made their report to Captain Graves, they stripped off their uniforms and washed away the dirt of their journey. Ada Weston had seen them arrive back, and she gently knocked on their door and ushered a private in with a meal for them. "I've told the colonel and the captain that you are off duty tomorrow," said Ada. "You never got the chance to get used to us here before you had to rush off again, so tomorrow you can sleep as long as you like." Sean and Patrick smiled and thanked her, with Patrick adding that it had been a long while since they had been looked after so well. She left, and they looked at one another. "I think that we are being mothered," said Patrick. "I wonder if she treats all new lieutenants this way." "I'm sure she does," smiled Sean. "But I don't think that I'll take her word that we won't be on duty tomorrow. I'd much rather hear that from the horse's mouth." They slept well that night, but were up at their usual early hour and made their way to the captain's office, who was surprised to see them. He smiled and said, "I was informed that you would not be on duty today, and it's more than my life is worth to go against the instructions of the colonel's wife." Patrick and Sean made their way back to their quarters and discussed what they would do. "We could go into town and see what is going on," said Patrick. "It will be very busy as it's Christmas Eve, and who you would like to bump into will probably be rushing around too much to even notice that you are there," said Sean. "I think that we should put our feet up so that we look presentable for tomorrow when we will make our way to the church for the Christmas morning service. I'm sure that Mrs. Liza Marchant will be attending the service, and you can then take it from there." I suppose you're right. Yes, we do look a little travel-weary, and we should look our best for Christmas morning," said Patrick, who had not thought about looking presentable for Christmas or going to church on that day for many years. There was a chill in the air and a slight fluttering of snow when Patrick and Sean made their way into town the following morning. The church was full when they arrived, and they stood at the back during the service. Patrick was delighted to see that Liza was sitting near the front, and she had a young Indian girl and a little boy with her. The young man that she had been talking to when Patrick had first seen her was also sitting with her, together with the owners of the general store. After the service, everyone was congregating outside the church, and Ben smiled and decided to introduce Patrick and Sean to Liza and those around her. Liza smiled and welcomed them to Benson and wished them a happy Christmas. Kathy stepped forward and asked what they were doing for Christmas lunch. "I'm sure that there will be something at the fort for us," said Sean, but the outcome was that they were both invited to Christmas lunch at the general store. Kathy had turned to Liza and just said that it was just as well that they cooked too much on that day, so 2 extra mouths would be useful, which meant that Patrick knew that Liza would be there, and he immediately accepted the kind invitation. Patrick made sure that he walked to the store with Liza, and he said that he hadn't realised that she had a son, but there was no mistaking who his mother was. He lifted Matthew up and carried him to the store, and Matthew couldn't resist pulling Patrick's nose, much to the amusement of Kathy and Joe's son, Daniel Osborne. That Christmas day was the beginning of Patrick's love for Liza, which was returned tenfold by Liza. I hope you enjoyed this insight into one of the leading characters in the Liza Marchant series. Next, it will be Gabriel Sanderson, who initially appears in For All Time, the first book in the series, which is now also available in audiobook form.